Funding for To the Contrary provided by the Cornell Douglas Foundation, committed to encouraging stewardship of the environment, land conservation, watershed protection, and eliminating harmful chemicals. Additional funding provided by the Wallace Genetic Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
Libraries provide access that you can trust. They are places that you can go to for information and you know that it is vetted.
Bonnie Bay. Welcome to the Contrary. This week we continue our Woman Thought Leader series with Dr. Carla Hayden. She's the 14th Librarian of Congress and the first woman and person of color to lead the library. Dr. Hayden was nominated to her position by President Barack Obama in 2016. Welcome, Dr. Hayden. How are you doing?
Thank you. It's great to be here during a time that we're celebrating women's suffrage.
And tell me, how did the library celebrate women's suffrage, and what was implemented by you that wasn't going to be done for this amazing, 100-year mark by your predecessor?
Well, I think that the library had plans, I know they did, to do something because the Library of Congress has the papers of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the National Women's Association and Party, Mary Church Terrell, a number of people involved in that 70-year trek for women's suffrage. However, I thought maybe we should do a full-blown exhibit that really emphasizes the length of the struggle and some of the other struggles, the racial element as well.
So let's start with the library and its importance to viewers out there who may not understand why it's so important to have a Library of Congress. I feel very lucky living in Washington, D.C., and I was trying to write a book a number of years ago, and I did it all in your incredible reading room and the incredible access to information that's still not on, although it's getting better, still a lot of information people don't realize if you're highly specialized is not online. And it is at the Library of Congress. Is that true for libraries all over the country? Do they have access to that?
Yes, and the wonderful thing is that we are putting more collections online. And a lot of people don't realize that the Library of Congress, of course, it serves Congress. We have a staff that just provides nonpartisan reference information for Congress. We call them our special forces, and they are the research arm of Congress. What people might not realize is the Library of Congress is the largest library in the world, 171 million items and 836 miles of shelving. If you went from Washington, D.C. to Davenport, Iowa, you might run out of shelving. It takes that much. And it has 3 buildings in the nation's capital, a wonderful facility in Culpeper, Virginia, with 14 million items of photography, motion pictures, and a special service for the blind and physically handicapped. All of these things are available to the public. And so we are trying to digitize as much as we can and make it available online.
Well, I know I've really educated myself in the last 5 to 10 years about slavery in America. I just didn't get it in high school. I didn't get that education. And back in the 60s, 70s, it wasn't in textbooks. So, and I've spent an awful lot of time on your website listening to the slave narratives that were recorded by the Roosevelt administration in the part of the New Deal, looking at pictures of, for example, Bloody Lane in the Battle of Antietam, the first photographs of war dead ever. Every other war depiction before then was a drawing or a painting.
And the library has the archive of Matthew Brady, who was the war photographer, and also Drew Faust, the first female president of Harvard, wrote a book and did most of her research on death and dying in the Civil War, and the fact that death had not been portrayed either in literature or in visual images before the Civil War and what it meant. So it's a rich resource for all types of researchers, but we want to make sure that just anyone that is interested in a subject can look at a collection of the world's largest collection of comic books.
But I'm in Idaho, for example. I live in Idaho. Why are my federal tax dollars going to the Library of Congress? What do I get out of the Library of Congress?
And I'm so glad you're asking that, because what we're trying to do is let people know that they can get online right now at loc.gov and download so many images, so many aspects that have been digitized that are unique to the Library of Congress and are available. The papers of Alexander Hamilton, Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt, Rosa Parks, all of these things are digitized, downloadable, and available. And you can connect to that largest library in the world because of your own tax dollars, and we are serving you.
When you have to go through budget hearings in Congress, does anybody ever ask, well, now that we have the internet and all this stuff can be placed on the internet, do we really need a Library of Congress anymore?
In fact, I was a public librarian, and in fact, two of my predecessors at the Library of Congress were public library directors. And librarians all over this country, in fact, even the world, are being asked that same question. Why do we need libraries when you can get anything online? And librarians all over the world are saying that libraries provide access that you can trust. They are places that you can go to for information, and you know that it is vetted in a way that gives you confidence. And it is a place, that third place in so many communities all over. So we are all connecting together technologically. I was just at the DC Public Library waiting to really get excited about their opening of their new central library. So these types of connections provide almost, if you think of it as a social infrastructure, libraries are part of that. The education system, the library systems, there are more public libraries in this country than a certain fast food chain. So that's not a bad thing, but that's where you can get a trusted source in the information.
Years ago, when the internet first became usable by civilians, they talked about the digital divide, that poor people didn't have access. Is that still true? And is that something that a hole that you fill?
It's still a challenge, and I just came back from a trip to Wyoming, and people forget about the rural areas having access problems as well, getting that high-speed network to have high-speed connections. 85 to 95% of all job applications, you have to register and apply online. And a lot of the government services are now e-government services. So having access to high-speed networks and being able to have that public free access is very important. So it's still a challenge and something that all of that social infrastructure we're all working on. And the Library of Congress, by putting most of its resources, many things that aren't copyright restricted, online, allows someone in that town in Wyoming to sit in their local public library and download and make a photo that they can frame of Dorothea Lange's migrant worker.
What is it that you haven't digitized yet? And is this an ongoing process, and how long will it take till you digitize everything?
I mentioned that 171 million items.
Right.
The papers of 23 presidents, we've already digitized Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, and we have George Washington, and quite a few other presidents to go. We also have the archive of Clara Barton, the founder of the Red Cross, and her diaries that showed that she suffered from depression and really had difficulty. So we are working on collections that are unique to the Library of Congress and that also relate to things, anniversaries, things that are happening. For instance, women's suffrage. We knew Susan B. Anthony's papers needed to be digitized for that. Woodrow Wilson with World War I. So when we are looking at calendars or significant events in history, what can we put up? We have a triage system in terms of digitizing.
But do you think all your materials will ever be online?
Everything, and might not. The Library of Congress, and this is where we think about the network of libraries, the research libraries at colleges and universities, large public libraries, D.C. Public, New York Public, Boston Public, have some of the same materials. So those things, we are looking at consortiums and who will digitize the best edition of a certain thing and putting out. There are a lot of things that the Library of Congress might have that will be already digitized, and now we're looking at things that are born digital. A lot of the ebooks and things that are coming out as well. So there will be a time that all of our manuscript collections are digitized, and I'm looking forward to that because there's some wonderful things in those collections. And the photographs that we have, 14 million photographs.
Oh my.
Yes.
Dating back to the beginning of photography, 1700s.
And as you probably know, Frederick Douglass was one of the most photographed people in history. And he knew that in terms of depicting race, that it was important to have and use that new tool. So quite an archive.
Now you are the first Library of Congress to actually have an educational background in library sciences. Why should people who go to the Library of Congress or use its facilities online, what difference would that make to them?
The fact that I'm the third librarian since 1800, that Librarian of Congress, that has a library background, and I have pretty extensive training as well, and taught library science. At this time in the history of libraries, I think is significant and helps bring the Library of Congress into the forefront, really, of how we can use technology as a tool. The library has had authors and historians, scholars, lawyers, different backgrounds at different times. And in fact, it has elevated the position over time of the Librarian of Congress. It started out mainly, it was the clerk of the Senate, the first Librarian of Congress in 1802 was that. And so over time, the position has changed. And I think now having a librarian as Librarian of Congress really helps us grow. We also have a term limit now.
But specifically, how is my access improved because you have training, graduate school training as a librarian?
Well, I hope that the public's access will improve because at this crucial time for all libraries, there's a person who has been involved with networking with all types of libraries, who really has been involved professionally with making sure that all libraries are looking at our joint forces. I've been told in my current position, I was at a conference with a lot of people who were involved with business and technology, and I was the only person, a librarian. And that person said to me, if you library people would get together, you have so much. If you would just join together, you could be a rival of any of the big tech companies or search companies. And I said, see, that's true. Because there is such a force when you think about school libraries, college libraries, public libraries, all of these libraries joining together its tour de force. So I think there is a benefit right now when people need that trusted information source that libraries pull together.
Well, when you say trusted information source, do you use the databases of newspapers, for example, that are seen as promulgating fake news? I mean, will you eliminate fake news from your collection?
Librarians, we almost take a oath. We have values and principles, and one of the things that we hold very dear is that we look for the most accurate information to provide. And so we even have courses in information literacy. And how do you determine what the best source, for instance, breast cancer? There are lots of things, but the National Institute of Health might have the best website. So librarians are trained to look at the authors of information, who is producing this information, and they will then select the best source. So that is something that librarians are trained to do and spend a lot of time in determining that. And they make decisions based on that. So when you think about it, it's a curated collection. It's a curated selection on your website if you go to a library website.
So, I mean, are there newspapers you don't carry because they run too many articles that are not factually proven?
The libraries that I've been associated, including the Library of Congress, look for a number of sources that are authoritative. And that's the way that libraries make the selection.
When you were appointed when you were president, of the American Library Association, you spoke out against the Patriot Act and urge other librarians to do the same. Please tell me about that.
Well, I have to clarify that a little bit. I was very honored to be selected by my colleagues to head the American Library Association. That's the advocacy arm of the library profession. And at that time, librarians in particular were concerned about a section of the Patriot Act, Section 215, that looked at records of all kinds, and there was not enough clarification about how the government could examine records, and especially the notification of a person. Say you're looking at, and this was a crucial time to remember, it was everyone was concerned about national security. However, people were also very interested in finding out more about jihad or different types of things. They were hearing sometimes things for the first time, and they wanted to know. And librarians were concerned that if the government was just looking without any verification or clarification of why they're looking at library records, because they were included on that interest could be misinterpreted as intent to do something. And the sticking point was that we couldn't tell a person that their records were being looked at. And over time, we worked with the federal government, and clarifications and differences in Section 215 were made, and we're very pleased with how that worked out.
Now, tell me, diversity is obviously a huge issue these days, and the country's becoming way more diverse. I live in a county where a magnet science school, 84 languages are spoken there. And yet there might be Americans who fund the library who don't want their money going towards funding, for example, a Portuguese digitized collection of literature or what have you.
The Library of Congress collects in over 470 languages, and it is based on Thomas Jefferson's collection from 1814 when there was a fire. The Library of Congress actually, before 1897, was located in the Capitol building, and there are wonderful photographs of books lined up in the halls of Congress. And so then they outgrew the Capitol building.
So Jefferson collected
Jefferson started,
languages?
He collected, he had when there was a fire and destroyed the books that were in the Capitol, Jefferson was retired by that time, but had one of the most comprehensive personal book collections. He had about approximately 6,000 volumes. And at that time, in 1815, that was quite a lot. And he had the Quran. He had things in different languages because he said there is no subject to which a member of Congress should not have to refer. And Congress purchased that collection, and the collection grew. And that idea that a national collection that would be for Congress and then eventually for the American people would have a worldwide scope has continued. And so people are able to access these materials, and we've been able to even repatriate materials to countries that have lost in natural disasters, Haiti, all that, to those countries because of our digitization efforts. So it's a national library with a worldwide view.
And so what percentage, for example, every year is spent on curating, buying other languages than English now?
I'd have to really find out exactly what percentage, because there are quite a few items that are part of the copyright system, and that provides materials that the library gets through a deposit thing. And also, there are 6 overseas offices that the library has that are collecting materials in the languages.
The internet has obviously become much more commercialized than when it started out. You could get just about anything for free online. And now JSTOR, for example, which I'm sure you're familiar with, all the scholarly articles on various, very not major topics that people care about in everyday life, but when you're talking about some PhD's thesis on a certain kind of cancer and cells and how they divide differently, what have you, that stuff's now in JSTOR. People have to pay for it. So yes, no, not at the library.
And not at some university libraries and public libraries. That's where the expenditures are going. When libraries are purchasing, they're going together in those consortiums that I mentioned to do bulk purchasing and cooperative purchasing of online databases. And that really helps quite a bit in terms of what libraries are able to provide.
How has the library been in terms of some of the history you mentioned, the American history you mentioned earlier? For example, literature by female writers back in the 1800s. Have you noticed, or Native American poetry? We now have a Native American poet laureate. What about poetry from Native Americans in the 1800s? First of all, is there a deficit in your mind in terms of the collection that exists? And are you out there trying to buy new manuscripts to improve that?
I was very pleased to be able to appoint Joy Harjo as the first Native American poet laureate. I was very honored to appoint Tracy Smith, poet laureate, 2 years ago as well. And what Joy is doing is going to our different collections and making sure that we are having the types of materials that she's more aware of because of her background as well. And our curators are very, very conscientious over time, too, of making sure that we collect very strongly in Native American materials. And we have a very good relationship with the museum that is in Washington, D.C. as well.
So, as a last question, you have a special exhibit about Rosa Parks. Please tell us about that.
We have the papers of Rosa Parks, and she was a prolific writer. She would take the back of an envelope and write, and she would write on all types of things. So the exhibit is going to emphasize her own words, and it's called Beyond the Bus for a reason, because people think of her as this iconic woman that was just sitting there. But she was an activist, and we have her writings that really show her involvement and how much she knew that she was part of a movement and knew that sitting on that bus was not just because she was tired.
And does the Smithsonian have that bus?
In fact, the Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan has the bus. The Smithsonian has the purse. And the Library of Congress has her handwritten notes about she felt so alone, so empty when she was in jail.
So thank you so much for being here and telling us all about the amazing things that you have at the library. And I hope your website will get a little more active with kids using it for comics, of which you have millions, and people will look at the slave narratives, which people still alive in the 1930s who had been slaves in the Old South before the Civil War, and they're amazing, amazing life stories. That's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/To the Contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the Cornell Douglas Foundation, committed to encouraging stewardship of the environment, land conservation, watershed protection, and eliminating harmful chemicals. Additional funding provided by the Wallace Genetic Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
Be more PBS.